and hello everyone. I'm Shannon, and I'll be introducing today's talk and speakers. So just to check, can everyone see my screen? Perfect. All right. Well, welcome. We're part of Yale Science in the News team, and today we'll be giving a talk on titled Brain Food, the Evolution and Application of Eating. And so before we get into the topic of this talk, I want to introduce our two speakers. The first one is Audrey, who is a part of Yale's anthropology department, and she researches how our environment and history have contributed to the differences in the genes of modern day human population. So how has our past impacted the genes of our present? And a fun fact about her is that on a field dig in Oklahoma, she helped to butcher an entire bison using stone tools. And I feel like I struggle with a normal fork and knife during dinner time, so I can only imagine how hard that was, Audrey. And then our second speaker for tonight is Grace, who is part of Yale's cell biology department, and she researches how things move inside of the brains of worms. And hopefully we'll be able to apply what she learns in worms to help us understand how our own brains function. And a fun fact about her is that she runs a game of Dungeons and Dragons every week for other graduate students at Yale. And so with a little bit about our speakers today, I'm now going to get into the topic of today's talk, which really revolves around this idea that humans have evolved over time, and our diets have also evolved a long time. So if we think back to our early human ancestors, they scavenged for food. So they had to look around, and they were known as hunters and gatherers to try and find different sources for food. But in today's day and age, you can just go down the street if you're in New Haven and pick up a Sally's Pizza at any time. And so our access to food has vastly changed over time, along with the way that it impacts us, not only on a long-term evolutionary scale, but also on the immediate week-by-week diets that we wind up having. And so our first talk is from Audrey, who will be talking about how has our diet changed as we evolved over time. And the second talk will feature Grace, who will discuss a little bit more about how does our diet change our brain on a shorter scale. And so with that, I invite Audrey to share her screen and take it away.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me and see my screen okay. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about the evolution of the human diet. How does our diet affect us and how has it changed over time? So, there we go. All right, so this talk is going to be two parts. The first part is going to go over ancestral diet, so what our ancestors ate and how this changed over time. And then the second part is going to go over some modern adaptations. So what differences do we still see in modern populations, and then how did diet lead to these differences? So first, I wanted to put into context why we even care about diet beyond it just being the food that we eat. And in the field of anthropology, there are several hypotheses that major changes in human evolution are tied to changes in our diet. So by changing the food that we eat, it was able to change us. So the main idea is that by going from foods that are kind of hard to eat, hard to break down, and don't give a lot of nutrients like grass and leaves, to something more like meat, we were able to get a lot more energy, like extract a lot more energy. And that allowed us to do things like grow bigger bodies and then grow larger brains as well. So for some additional context about where we are and some of these ancestors that we're going to be talking about today. So we're here at the top of the tree. We're Homo sapiens, and Homo sapiens is thought to have appeared about where this red arrow is on the screen. So about 300,000 years ago is when we see the earliest fossils of Homo sapiens. But if we go all the way back down to the bottom of the tree here, we have quite a long history of human ancestry. So starting from about 4 to 6 million years ago, we see this this Ardipithecus group. And Ardipithecus is a small-bodied human ancestor. They're a little bit more like chimp-sized, probably living in the trees, and small brains as well. Then if we move up in time to now about 3 to 4 million years ago, we see Australopithecus. Australopithecus is now a little bit more larger bodied. Their brains have grown a little bit bigger, and some species of Australopithecus have started walking on the ground and not so much in the trees anymore. Then we have Paranthropus. So Paranthropus are our extinct cousins. So there are no living Paranthropus today. There's no living species of Paranthropus. At some point in time, they went extinct, but they are our cousins. And then finally, we have Homo, which is our group. And this includes things like you might have heard of Neanderthal. Neanderthal is also a species of Homo. And then, of course, again, us at the top of the tree. So we'll talk about a few of these groups later on in the talk as well. Okay, so I wanted to give you some major time points in changes in human diet. So there's a lot of things that are occurring along this lineage that we're not going to be discussing. This is really just major advancements in diet. So we're going to be talking about things like meat eating, fire use, cooking, and then farming. And I wanted to first draw your attention to these 2 points here. So as you saw from the tree, humans and great apes split about 6 to 7 million years ago. That's when we have those earliest ancestors, Ardipithecus. Then 2.5 to 3 million years ago, we see evidence of the first meat eating. Okay, so let's take a closer look at these points. So our human ancestors moved from living in this forest environment where we were probably more up in the trees. And that forest environment is something similar to what we see chimps and gorillas in today. So they were probably eating things like leaves, grasses, tree bark. But around this time, like 3 to 5 million years ago, we start seeing this movement, and our human ancestors moved out from the forests and started living on the open grassland, the open savanna. And with this, we had access to different types of resources that could be found in the forests. And what's really interesting is that around the same time, there's a change in behavior. So our human ancestors started making tools around 3 million years ago. So this here is a picture of some of the earliest tools that have ever been found, and they're 3.2 million years old. And you can see they look pretty basic. You might just mistake them for, a rock on the ground. But by the time we get to about 2 million years ago, we get these types of tools. So they're a little bit more refined. We can kind of see with some of these ones, they have a sharp edge and a place you can hold them. And it's thought that with these tools, we were then able to have access to more types of food. So we could probably scavenge meat. So at this point, there's no hunting really going on. Human ancestors are still pretty small bodied, but we were probably finding already dead animals and then scavenging the meat or crushing their bones to get at the marrow inside them, all of which are really energy-rich foods. And it also could have allowed us to do things like dig up tubers, like potatoes and yams, which again are a huge source of energy. So these are major changes that allowed us to have much more energy coming into our diet. So then from that point, we're going to take a major leap forward in time. So we're jumping now from about 2.5 to 1.8, 1.5 million years ago. So about a 1 million year difference here. And there's a lot of things happening in this space and time. But the big major thing that comes next in terms of human diet is fire use. And then with that, around 780,000 years ago, we see evidence of cooking. So with the first evidence of fire use, that pops up around 1.8 million years ago. And at this point, humans were probably not controlling fire. Instead, it's thought that humans' ancestors were attracted to the remains of wildfires or lightning fires, which would have driven away animals from their nests or killed smaller animals. And again, these would have been good resources to try and find eggs or scavenge meat. But by about that 800,000 years ago mark, we start seeing evidence that humans at this point had already started controlling fire. So this is a seed from a site just outside of Africa that is burned. And at the same site, there's lots of burned seeds, which indicate that the human ancestors that were living here were burning these seeds. So they were controlling this fire. And then by about 400,000 years ago, we start seeing fire everywhere. So it's popping up in Africa, it's in Asia, and it's in Europe. So really by this time point that's very far back in time, 400,000 years ago, we can see that fire has become a really important way of life for all human ancestors. And the reason why that's important is because of the use of fire in cooking. So cooking makes our food so much easier to break down. It really softens it. If we were eating raw foods, like this is raw wheat, this is the equivalent of eating cardboard, right? We're not getting a lot of nutrients out of it. It's really hard to chew and break down. Whereas once we start cooking it, so these are some cooked wheat berries, it's much, much easier for our stomach to digest. And this was actually shown in a study that looked at how digestible wheat is. And they found that once we started cooking it, you get this 34% increase in digestibility. So we're extracting a lot more nutrients and energy out of cooked foods rather than raw food. And what's really interesting is that we can see an actual physical change in our human ancestors compared to us to show that humans have adapted to this cooked diet, that over these hundreds of thousands of years that we've been cooking, we've really adapted to it. So first of all, if we take a look at our teeth, so remember Australopithecus from the tree, this is one of our ancestors from about 3 to 4 million years ago. And if you look at our back teeth compared to their back teeth, you can see how much bigger the Australopithecus back teeth are here. And it's been hypothesized that they needed these in order to really grind down on hard raw foods. Whereas humans, of course, we're eating these softened foods. We don't need that anymore. Then, if we look at the skeletal structure, so this here, again, is Australopithecus, the same Australopithecus. Then we have Paranthropus. So remember, these are our extinct cousins. And then this is a Homo sapiens skull. So if we look at some of the key differences here, first of all, their lower jaw. We can kind of see how big the lower jaw is in these two compared to Homo sapiens. Ours is pretty skinny. And then we can see this ridge at the top of the head. So we can see on the humans, it's pretty flat, like rounded there. But on these two here, they have that kind of point. It's a ridge that goes down the top of their skull. And then finally, we have this arch on the side of our heads. And again, in humans, it's pretty skinny. But if we look at these two, they have two very thick arches here. And the idea is that because these two came from a time when humans were not controlling fire, human ancestors were not cooking, they really needed these big kind of bony structures for muscles to attach to deal with the stress of having to chow down on really hard raw food. Whereas humans, because we've adapted to cooking, we no longer need to grow these really big bony structures. And instead, cooking has done half of the process of digesting our food for us. So it's a really interesting case where we can see physical changes. All right, and then the final point I wanted to talk about is early farming. So now this is another huge leap in time. We're jumping to about 20 to 12,000 years ago. And as we can see from where this yellow diamond is here, this is the only change that's coming up after Homo sapiens is now in existence. So we can really think of all of these previous steps we talked about as incremental steps that increased how much energy we were intaking that really led to us becoming Homo sapiens over time. So then with farming, this was another huge change in the human lifestyle. So before we were hunting and gathering, eating this diet of like maybe some leaves, some fruits, nuts and seeds. But now humans have settled down. They've chosen 1 or 2 crops to grow, and our diet is a lot less varied than it was before. But at the same time, we now have so much energy coming in that this allows for the human population to really boom and grow. And because we are experiencing such a change in diet now, this could also be another pressure for diet-related traits like our body size. Great, so now that we've gone through this timeline of major changes that have happened thousands to millions of years ago, I wanted to take a look at a real-life study of differences that we can see in populations today that are related to these changes in the past. Okay, so we're going to be talking about lipids and fatty acids. So if we take a look at this pyramid here on the side, it's a kind of a simple food pyramid. And I'm sure you've heard that we want a pretty good balance of these foods down here, grains and cereals, fruits and veggies, and then some proteins. But often we're told that we don't want to eat a lot of fats and sugars. These are really not good for you. But really, there are a lot of different types of fats, or lipids as they're also known, that are really, really important for your body. You need them to be able to perform normal bodily functions. And some of these include foods like olive oil, fish oil, and oils from nuts and seeds. And you'll hear a lot more about the structure of these in Grace's talk. But for now, all you have to know is that lipids or fats are made up of fatty acids. So fatty acids are like the small building blocks that come together to make these larger types of different types of fats. And they come in different lengths. So we have short chain fatty acids, which we can see from this little diagram up here. Just like they sound, are small linked chains of these fatty acid building blocks. And these can be found in foods like eggs, greens, meat, and nuts and seeds. But then we also have long chain fatty acids. And just like they sound, they're almost the same, but now we have these longer chains. They're forming longer chains of fatty acids. And what's interesting is that these are not found in the same types of food. These can be much more easily found in food that comes from aquatic sources. So our oceans, rivers, and lakes. And this includes food like seaweed, fish, clams, shrimp, and even mammals like whales and seals. But what we do need is we need both of these different types of fatty acids to perform different functions in our body. They each have a unique purpose. So one of the purposes of the long chain fatty acids is to help make the structure of our brain. So our brain is made up of a lot of fat, which again, you'll hear a lot more about that in Grace's talk. But you might be thinking, so what if I don't have a lot of access to fish, right? But I still need this long chain fatty acid for my brain. And what scientists found is that our body actually has a gene to help us along with this. So we can think of genes as an operating system for the body. It's like a set of directions our body can read, and it knows what to make for our body to function normally. So they found this gene called FADS right here. And FADS makes an enzyme, also called FADS. And we can think of an enzyme as something that just has a very particular purpose. It has a single purpose. And FAD's purpose is to make short chain fatty acids into long ones. So it's going to find these free-floating building blocks, these free-floating fatty acids, pick them up, and then connect them to short chain fatty acids, so that now this short chain fatty acid is a long chain fatty acid, and it can go perform its purpose as a fat in our brain. But then scientists wanted to look closer into fats. They wanted to know if there might be differences between people all over the world. And this is what they found. So if these two people here on the left side here have version 1, and version 1 is just this purple stripe, they found that version 1 makes 1 copy of the FADS gene. And 1 copy isn't that efficient, so that makes 1 copy of the long chain fatty acid. But then they found that these two people here on the right have a red stripe at the exact same location. So this is version 2. And version 2 makes more of the FADS enzyme. So they make 2 copies. And these 2 copies are more efficient. So they can then make 3 copies of the long-chain fatty acid. So they're making more for every one that these 2 on the left here are making. So then you might be asking, if we really need this for our brain, why would anybody have this? You think that this would not be advantageous to be making less of the long-chain fatty acids. And to answer that question, we have to go back and look at the diet. So scientists looked at a very unique population. So this is the Greenlandic Inuit. And if you've ever heard anything about the Inuit, you might know that they live up in these Arctic regions where it's very hard to grow any kind of crops. So their food consists of things like whales, meat and proteins like fish, and then seals as well. So it's this very fat-heavy, meat-heavy diet. Whereas we compare that to nearby Europeans, they have a little bit more of a varied diet. So they're eating things like breads and pastas, still some meat and fish, and also some like leafy greens and vegetables. So it's much more varied in terms of the type of food coming in than the Inuit might be getting. So they wanted to know, are there differences in the Inuit that we can see to make up for the fact that they have this very unique diet that's very fat heavy? And that's exactly what they found. So remember that version 1 and version 2 of the gene, and version 1 is less efficient, right? It's making less of the long chain fatty acid. And they found that with the Inuit that had version 1 of the gene, they had lower weights. And with lower weights, it was also associated with lower risk for things like high cholesterol and heart disease. So it seemed that in this population, the Greenlandic Inuit, these changes in FADs, these different versions, really helped make up for the fact that their diet was so heavy in fat already that they didn't need to make any more. So then scientists wanted to look further into these differences all around the world. So just to remind you, remember that version 1 is this purple, and it's not super efficient. And then version 2 is the red, and it's more efficient. So when they looked at this pattern all around the world, this is what they found. So this is the Inuit here in the purple. So they have, pretty much everyone has that version 1 of the gene. And we see that pattern kind of repeating in areas where they're living by the ocean and they have that heavy kind of aquatic fish diet. So in places like Indonesia here. Whereas if we look at some of these more landlocked countries like in Africa, where you might have less access to fish and other aquatic resources, we can see they have very, very high numbers of that version 2 of the gene, whereas they can make their own long chain fatty acids on their own because they aren't getting it from their diet. So this is a really, really interesting visible difference in populations all around the world of a change in our bodies, in our genes because of diet. Right, so I hope that in conclusion, this showed you that food is really much more than just the things that we eat. Over time, the food and environment around us has really influenced our evolution as humans. And then our bodies have evolved to eat this balanced diet that has some fat, it has some starches, it has some leafy greens. And in cases where we can't have that, like in the Greenlandic Inuit, our bodies and genes have really changed to reflect what we need from our environment. All right, so we've just gone through millions of years of changes in the human diet, but now we're going to focus in on short-term changes, changes in the modern day, the here and now. And Grace is going to talk about some of the different types of fats that we eat, what these fats are made of, and then what they do in our bodies. Thank you.
Awesome talk, Audrey. My turn. Very excited. Let's share my screen. Okay. I'm taking your nodding, Audrey. So thanks so much, Audrey. So Audrey had, I think, a more of a broad view of human history, and I'm going to be now really specific, talking about kind of just you, and talking about how what we eat affects our bodies, and specifically, I'm going to focus on fat, and I am going to focus on the brain. So to get started, I think Audrey did a wonderful job highlighting on how, as humans evolved, we went through many different diets, and we went through these different diets over millions of years. So there was these incredibly slow and incremental changes. However, with global trade nowadays, we could change our diet dramatically from day to day. On any given day, you could be completely vegetarian, completely carnivore, you could eat only blueberries or dragon fruits or whatever, okay? But even though we have this power now, it's still important to stay balanced in what we eat. And to emphasize that point, I'm going to talk about myself. So extremes are bad for your body. They make you feel bad. And my example would be, I'm a graduate student, so science is my profession. And sometimes I end up working kind of late. Like today, I barely got here in time for the talk, but usually I'll actually even work later than that. And sometimes when it's sort of 7 or 8 o'clock in the lab and you're kind of tired and you're hungry because you haven't had dinner, you decide you want to have some candy. And our lab has a little hidden drawer that's full of candy. So I may have a Snickers, but unfortunately, I often end up basically having candy for dinner because I'm really hungry and it's right there. And this is extremely bad. I may be briefly less hungry, but then I'm kind of cranky and tired and like vaguely mad at myself. So it's just sort of doesn't end well for anybody, but mostly me. So I think it's important to emphasize, although that's an extreme example, you are in general healthier, and you also feel better with balance. You can seek variety in the foods that you choose to eat. You're just going to have a better everyday experience of life. So I'm going to talk about how just one nutrient, fat, that you can choose to eat many different kinds of, affects your brain. And I'm going to emphasize that just like protein or vitamins or anything else we choose to consume, it's just as important to think about fat as a nutrient and how we need to consume different sources of fat. So to get started, I'm going to emphasize the importance of the brain. The brain is, I think, inarguably the most important organ of the body, is what makes us human. It controls us and it controls how we see the world. And incredibly, I think the brain is 50% fat. If you kind of plucked your brain out and you put it on a scale and you also dried it out to get rid of all that water, you would find it is 50% fat by weight. And your brain needs many different fats to function probably. There are hundreds of different fats that your brain uses, but in my talk, I'll just talk about a couple of them. So this key brain nutrient can be broken down into 2 broad categories. I'm going to start with saturated fats. So to talk about fats, I'm going to need to talk about a little tiny bit of chemistry. So let me introduce some chemical symbols. First, we have C for carbon, we've got H for hydrogen, and we have O for oxygen. Now, these elements are important because the shape of the fat determines its function. So how the fat organizes those carbons and hydrogens and oxygens is actually going to determine how it interacts with your body. So if we take a look at a saturated fat, what we'll first see is there's going to be a small group with oxygens on one side. And then you'll have a, I want to go back, a nice long tail that has a lot of carbons and hydrogens. And one other thing I want you to notice is that in the small group on the side, you have 2 lines connecting this carbon, this oxygen, and this is a double bond. This means they're more closely associated. This will come up later. Now, if you are an unsaturated fat, which is the other big category of fat in our body, you are going to look like this. You're going to have a small group with oxygens, again, just like the saturated fat. But you're going to be bent in the middle because you have a double bond somewhere in the middle of all of these carbons and hydrogens, and that's going to affect your function. Now, both of these fats are crucially important to the function of the body. You cannot get by with only one of them. And what I always like to talk about is basically you need these different shapes in order to face different challenges. So where do you get these fats from? So again, this is what the shape of the saturated fat is. It's how you can recognize it. It's got the long tail. They've got only single bonds, only single connections. It's saturated because it's saturated by hydrogens. It's got as many hydrogens as possible. And saturated fats are very stiff and stable molecules, and that's good for your body, gives it some structure. And they are solid at room temperature. You can generally recognize a saturated fat out in the wild because it'll be solid when it's sort of sitting in your kitchen. So you would think of a common source as being like the fat that you feed in meat. You would get, that's butter as a saturated fat, for example. And you can also get saturated fat from some fruits and vegetables like coconuts. Now, an unsaturated fat, which is the bent fat, it has at least one double bond somewhere messing up the nice straight shape of the tail. And this bent shape is going to change its function, its properties. And what it ends up happening is that these are less stiff and stable fats. They're kind of wiggly and floppy, and that makes them appear as liquids and room temperature. So your kind of standard plant fat, your canola oil, your olive oil, your sesame oil, etc. And then also it's actually a really important fat source for unsaturated fats is fish, which I'll talk about more in just a second. So although in this talk, I'm going to be really hesitant to give you any specific advice about your diet because I'm not a medical doctor, I would like to mention that in the research, I think it is generally agreed upon that the best fat is omega-3 fatty acids. And the reason omega-3 fatty acids are so awesome is first, they're unsaturated, and then they're super, super bent, right? They've got all these double bonds in them. And they're also really long. So this fat mostly comes from fish, but also some nuts, and it's really, really good for your brain. So there's some associations between populations, groups of people who eat a lot of omega-3 fatty acids and having better brain health and lower incidence of Alzheimer's. So I feel happy recommending increasing this amount of fat in your diet. But now that I've talked about saturated and unsaturated fat, I want to emphasize again that your body needs both kinds of fat, and that's because life needs us to be a combination of flexible and sturdy. So I'm going to talk about some specific kinds of saturated and unsaturated fats that are used by the body. So you have a better idea of like what you eat, how it's actually working inside your body to keep you alive. So I'll start with the phospholipids. So a phospholipid, breaking this name down, phospho means it contains the element phosphorus, lipid just means fat. Phospholipids are the fundamental component of all cell membranes. So every single cell in your body is coated by phospholipids. And what they end up looking like are two interlaced hands, the fingers being the long tail of the phospholipids. So here, these fingers are really helpful for your body because some of the fingers are unsaturated, which means they're floppy, and others are saturated, which means they're stiff. And this combination means that your cell membrane can do a lot of tasks. Sometimes it can be really sturdy if it's undergoing some pressure, and sometimes it can be really flexible, so it can kind of flow around. And what the phospholipids actually look like is you'll have a bunch of these heads, which I introduced earlier. That would be the small heads with the oxygens. And then you have a bunch of tails meeting in the middle. And then you have some other phospholipids here. And it forms what's called a bilayer because there's always two phospholipids together with their tails touching. Next, I'll talk about the sphingolipids. I love the sphingolipids. The sphingolipids vaguely look like this in your cell. So sphingo means sphinx-like, which I think is a wonderful little root. And the reason that they're called sphingo is because these fats were really late to be discovered, much later than other fats. And so here's a picture of the sphinx. And then lipid just means fat. The sphingolipids are this incredibly important armor for the cell. They're really wrapping around the cell, and they're very stiff and resistant. They are produced from saturated fat, which I think is a good example of saturated fat. You know, this is good. You know, it's good for you. It's doing something in your body that's important. And I wanted to show you this actual picture, not a cartoon. This is an electron micrograph, which is a way of taking like a really incredibly zoomed in picture of a cell. And without totally going into what's going on here, the middle of this thing, that's a cell. And this like bubble wrap that's going around the cell, that's most of that is sphingolipids. So you can see that really like in life, it actually does, I feel like, kind of look like the tire just going around the cell and protecting it. Next, I'll talk about glycolipids. Glycolipids are really simple. Glyco means sugar, lipid means fat. So it's just a fat with a sugar. And the glycolipid is really important for your immune system because it acts as an ID card to tell your body that this is your cell. It's a highly saturated fat. It's a really short and it's really, really stiff. And so you can think of it as just sort of studding the outside of the cell membrane. You've got these glycolipids, your immune cell, it comes by and it's like, okay, you belong here, and then it moves along. So clearly it's incredibly important for your health. Finally, we've got the cholesterol. Cholesterol is really weird. So chol means from the liver, and esterol means an alcohol group, which is just a way, you can think of it as it has more oxygens and hydrogens than other fats. But it's still a fat, even though its name is weird and it doesn't have lipid in the name. Cholesterol is an incredibly important cell support structure. Now, cholesterol is unfortunately prone to doing things it's not supposed to do. Instead of protecting your cell, it's getting into your bloodstream. It's creating this plaques and leading to heart disease. But that's not the role of cholesterol. And the overwhelming majority of all the cholesterol in your body is good, and it's doing what it's supposed to do. And what it's supposed to do is, by forming this very unusual ring structure, cholesterol doesn't have a long tail like all the other fats. It's like a wonderful flexible suit of chainmail that goes around your cell and is really protecting it from outside stresses. Now, going back out, I talked briefly about these 4 very important kinds of fats, and I'm going to kind of draw back to what I mentioned at the start of my talk and talk about how these fats help the brain. So one of the challenges your brain cells face is that they are really big, so they need a lot of fat. So most cells in your body are incredibly, incredibly, incredibly small. Here's a standard cell that it's not to scale. And its size is smaller than a grain of dust. It's exceedingly, exceedingly small. Now, your sciatic nerve, which a lot of people know of because a lot of people have back pain, is one single cell. And it is 10,000 times as long as sort of the standard cell in your body. So you can imagine the sciatic nerve is going to have some very different requirements than just some random cell in your lung or in your heart. Furthermore, your nerves have to do a lot of work as you live your life. As you're moving around, bending your knees, you're bending one single cell in the middle over and over and over again. So it's going to have to be sturdy so it doesn't break open, and also flexible so that it can bend in order to perform this function, and therefore it's going to get a lot of benefit from the sturdy saturated fat and the flexible unsaturated fat. So going through these fats, how do they help your sciatic nerve? First, the phospholipid. Well, you got to have a cell membrane, and you're going to need a lot of it because the cell is so huge. Phospholipids are really flexible. The sphingolipid is this super protective wrap of the cell. It's really sturdy, so it's going to help keep your nerve intact. The glycolipid is going to keep you from having a horrible neurodegenerative disease by labeling your nerve and preventing your immune system from attacking it. Glycolipids are small, but they're very tough. And then the cholesterol is going to protect the nerve, and because of its weird ring shape, it can either be flexible or sturdy depending on a bunch of different conditions. It's very versatile, which is awesome. So now that I've talked about what the fats do, I'm even going to zoom out a little bit more and talk about, well, how do we even know that these fats are in the brain? So there's this very cool field of science called lipidomics. Breaking this word down, lipid is fat and omics is big data. If you ever heard of genomics, this is a similar word. And you can think of big data as just getting data from many, many thousands or millions of different sources and then kind of putting it all together and trying to figure something out from it. So via lipidomics, we are able to actually figure out the fractions of the different kinds of fats in the brain. And very, very kind of vaguely and overall, you have a lot of phospholipids and a lot of cholesterol, and not quite as much as sphingolipid and glycolipid in your brain. Now, to figure this out, they did something really awesome. So they took a brain, not your brain, they took some unfortunate mouse's brain. And what they did is they cut this brain into a bunch of pieces. And once they cut the brain into a bunch of pieces, they did some very fancy things to each slice of the brain. And after that, they were able to measure how much of every kind of lipid is in each slice of the brain. So with this data, they're able to figure out, oh, X part of the brain has got why fats, and so on and so forth. Now, once you know the lipidome or the kinds of fat in the brain, you can do things like measure changes, which is really important for understanding how diets affect us, for example. And so I want to talk about a really interesting recent experiment done to understand how diet changes what fats are in the brain. So what they did in this experiment is they fed 3 special diets to either adults or pups. And these 3 special diets were fish oil capsules, safflower oil, or beef tallow. And those are simply just really good sources of omega-3 fatty acids, unsaturated fat, or saturated fat. Now, the data they got is in the form of a heat map. Heat maps I find really complicated, but just I think one thing to remember is if you see a darker color, that means you have more of something. And if you have a lighter color, you have less of something. So in the data they got in this paper they wrote, they would get these colors for many different kinds of fat in the brain. So they would do some diet A, and they would see that increases the amount of a fat in the brain. And they would see that this other diet B decreases the amount of a fat in the brain, and thereby come to an overall conclusion that diet A has more of fat 1 than diet B. And they did this for hundreds and hundreds of kinds of fats. And overall, what they saw is that we can actually change in weeks the proportions of fats in the brain, which I think is super exciting and super cool, and really different from how our diet evolved over millions of years. So we're not only changing over a long time scale, but also a really short time scale. So when we changed our diets over millions of years, we made these big changes, kind of in like our physical bodies, in the shapes of our mouths and the shapes of our skulls. But these really short-term diet changes can actually really physically change our brain by changing what fat is in our brain. And I think that's really exciting and really hopeful, because that means that, you know, if you make some unfortunate choice of having your Snickers for dinner, that's not the end of the world. You know, you are always able to change yourself with time and effort. And by choosing this diverse diet, you can give your brain a wide source of fats and really support it in helping you live your best life. So thank